Thank you, Ruby. This is so fun.
Thank you.
We've been in touch for so many years. This is the first time we've been on stage together.
I know. It's extraordinary to meet you.
I am such a great fan of this book, Vagabond Princess. As you just heard, it's the biography of Gulbadan Begum, a woman who is so extraordinary and yet strangely lost to history. Someone I knew a tiny bit about, but learned so much about her place in the Mughal Empire, the reasons why she has been overshadowed by some of the more famous men of the Mughal Empire that we all know about, and obviously this extraordinary moment in her life where she took this pilgrimage, a woman's pilgrimage, to Mecca. We're going to talk about all of those things. I'm going to make sure that you all have an active role in this conversation, so I'll be reaching out to you a little bit earlier than normally happens. But what I want to do is begin, especially for those in the audience who are unfamiliar with Gulbadan and her role in the Mughal Empire. Could you just tell us a little bit about who she was and what made her so fascinating to you as a historian?
Certainly. First of all, I'm delighted and deeply honored to be having this conversation. I want to thank all of you for coming, and to the Boulder Public Library, JLF, all the amazing people behind this. Princess Gulbadan, of course we know her nominally as the daughter of Babur, the founding figure of the great Mughals of India. But the way I want to introduce her is rather differently, which is to say that forever humans have been moving and migrating in history. There is absolutely no land that we can think of that is not premised upon movement and migration. And so she came, Gulbadan, like many other people of her era and beyond until today, came from a dynasty, an illustrious dynasty that spread its territorial, mental, emotional hold over parts of Central Asia, Afghanistan, Iran, and then into northern India, exemplified that curiosity and movement. That's who she was. That's the kind of dynasty that she comes from. So her father, Babur, who's himself an extraordinary, he's a poet, he's a wanderer, he's a conqueror, he loves to drink with his men, he's curious, he writes one of the most beautiful chronicles in his time. So there is this man in her life, but there are also extraordinary women around her. These are women. The stories of these women are exquisite in the sense that they're full of courage, they're full of valor, they're full of the brilliance that you don't think that women can or do embody in history. So for example, they participated quite actively, not by holding the gun, but by being in war zones, by rendering sacrifices such as, for example, Babur's sister Khanzada Begum was handed over to one of his most ardent enemy in order to secure safe exit for him from a really very important battle, the battle in Samarkand. So there are details like that. All of this to say movement, migration, curiosity, a multiplicity, a plurality. I think this is what she embodies. I think this would be the best way to introduce her. And this is what drives me to stay with a figure like her.
I want to talk more about her in particular, but you brought up something very interesting, because we have to remember this is 600 years ago, and yet the role of women in the Mughal Empire, kind of surprising. How would you describe the special place that women had in that court?
So there is what I tell my students, bullet point view of history of teaching about so-called role of women, right? I mean, they served as diplomats, counselors, writers, thinkers, storytellers, all sorts of things. But I think the extraordinary thing to think is that we from a modern standpoint, we make certain kinds of assumptions about their personalities, about their personhood. And I think the automatic assumption is, first of all, in contemporary sort of thinking, that in the Mughal dynasty, these were Muslim women, so automatically that they were veiled and they were, that they lived in the harem, none of which was true. The harem doesn't come to be built in the dynasty until so-called Akbar the Great, which is a tautology. Akbar actually means the great. So I don't know why historians call him the great. But anyway, so he is Gulbadan's nephew. It's only under him that the first harem, actually, and that in itself is a huge history, that comes to be, right? So so what is the personhood of these women? What are they doing? I gave the example of being in war zones. When Khanzada comes back after 10 years of being bartered, there is no judgment on her return, right? She is received immediately as the elder. She's not that much older, but she's received as the elder, the wise woman, the future counselor, things like that. Storytelling was deeply embroiled into the personhood of people, and it is through stories that were part of history, that were part of myth, very much created the personhood of these people. Advice. Again, movement is one thing that I've been almost overwhelmed by the amount of. So movement, I have come to think not just of the bodies, but of mind and bodies. So what does that do to figures? And so these are the ancestresses of Gulbadan that surround her world, if that makes sense.
You mentioned writing, and among the many extraordinary things about Princess Gulbadan is that she got to tell her own story. She was the author, of an extraordinary text that we refer to as the Humayun Nama. It's a text that was almost lost to history. There's a lot of it that is missing or redacted. So I want to ask actually two questions on this. Number one, what do we learn about her from herself rather than from the writings of others when you read this text? And number two, we can't get past, the fact that this is a text that, at least you seem to suggest, was deliberately suppressed in later periods of time. That there was it's not an accident that this was a lost piece of writing. So first of all, tell us a little bit about what we learned from her own words, and then what does it mean that this text seems to have been deliberately suppressed? Mm-hmm.
Those are extraordinary questions, and they are the questions that have driven the writing of this book. I do want to say that this is not the first time while writing this book that I got to know Gulbadan. I actually began my career by first encountering her as a graduate student in England. Her manuscript is held at the British Library, classified as Oriental 166. And I was the first scholar to bring it to the attention of the scholarly world, based upon her memoir, by historicizing exactly what I was talking about, that is, deepening and layering and thinking about what is a harem, who are the denizens of the harem, when does it come to be. So she was seminal in my thinking. Her book breaks off, as it is housed on folio 83, mid-sentence. And a lot of folios are all over the place. So I had known that fact. I had also established in that first book that when Gulbadan is an older woman in her 50s, she comes to live. She's completely itinerant, all the time. But at that point, she comes to live in the harem of Akbar the Great, who we were just talking about. But she will not live there for too long, and she devises this extraordinary conversation with him, sitting across from him saying, look, long ago, I had made a vow to go to the holy places, that is Mecca and Medina, and the time has come. And they sit across from each other, with rather different kinds of intentions. This is late 1577. The Muslim millennium is arriving. Like many monarchs and sages and mystics, Akbar has the great aspiration to be the leader of Islam, so it cannot hurt him that the women of his harem are going to go on a pilgrimage. Gulbadan has rather different intentions, and that ties with your first question, who is she, as we know through her own writing. Who she is, and I struggled a lot despite the writing, and there's a reason why I struggled, to think the personhood, as I was saying, of this person. Of course, as I've been saying, was a deeply itinerant woman, as was her dynasty. She was the first Mughal girl to come to India in the aftermath of Babur's victories. He dies. Her brother becomes the king. He loses the empire to Sher Shah. She goes back to Afghanistan. So there's a lot of going and coming that is taking place. But what remains at the heart of her life is this kind of, life of movement. And this is really what she charts in this memoir. Where were the women going? How many children were dying? Which women? Lists of women being bartered in the interest of the dynasty, right? Mughal dynasty, not of the lore and peacock throne and the beauty and the glamour, but the Mughal dynasty as it was being made. No palaces, no harem. How were women negotiating all of this? This is who she was. This is what she embodies as it comes through in the memoir. And I will add one line. This is really what made the Mughal male historians, modern male historians, extremely uncomfortable, because she is not pinnable, right? This is not an institutionalized history. This is not a history that sings the praises of men on top. But in fact, I think she does wonders, which is she also humanizes the men, right? Even the male-dominated histories have been one in which, whether any of the Mughals or the great lieutenants that you take, they're like cardboard characters, right? There is no vulnerability that is so much a part of humanity in a way. So I think these were some of the reasons because of which a well-known text, the only chronicle, prose by a woman of the entire era, had been known but marginalized. So I think these are the reasons. I won't jump yet to why it was, because there's a long story that we need to tell about the, what happens when she actually goes to Arabia, because the missing pages, as I have now assessed, are tied to that.
Yes, and that's what I want to talk about. And I do want you to prepare your questions, because we're going to go right to you right after this conversation, and then we'll just have you kind of guide where we go next. But she had an extraordinary life in so many different ways, as we've talked about it. But she's a vagabond princess because, well, actually, to be perfectly frank, she was a sort of adventurous individual. She had a lot of experiences with the outdoors and all of that stuff. But then there was this one incredible moment, almost a defining moment, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca that she takes. And the first thing that I would love for you to establish for everyone, because it's hard for us to understand what it would have meant 600 years ago to travel from the subcontinent to the Arabian Peninsula. For anyone to do that, but for a group of women to do that. So first, if you could just lay the context for that. This isn't like it is. You don't get on a plane and show up and stay at the Hilton, and that's not how it works. In fact, oftentimes, if you were declaring at this period of time that you were making a pilgrimage to Mecca, that meant that was a one-way trip. We're very likely not going to see you again. So first, talk about just in general what that meant. But then if you could just add that extra aspect to it, which is the unique challenges that a group of women would have had in this journey, and the extraordinary nature of how this pilgrimage actually came about. That would be wonderful. And then get ready, because we're moving on to you.
Yes, I think I'll begin by just dwelling a little bit on what was happening to me as I was writing about precisely this very question. So Gulbadan gets the permission. Another first is that this is the only cluster pilgrimage that takes place, but that means these were not just 11 women on their own, okay? 2 ships, they are representative of the great Mughal of India. So 2 ships, Sai and Ilahi, go. It was state policy that ordinary people would get free passage as they traveled with them. Also, notionally, it was always that male people had to accompany them, but there was a translator, there was a Hajj commander, so there was this array of attendants and cooks but also boxes and boxes of cash, of dresses of honor, of arms, right? Innumerable. I've documented all of that. To be given to religious authorities, ordinary people, beggars, and I'll speak something about Western Arabia at this point. But they leave from Fatehpur Sikri, come to the west, Surat, gateway of India. And at this point, it is the Portuguese that are in charge of the sea lanes. And in charge meant that even the great Mughal had to take a kartaz or a permission for the ladies to disembark. The understanding between Gulbadan and Akbar, her nephew, was that the kartaz had been arranged. But when they reached Surat, there was no kartaz. So they had to stay a year. And there was only one line I came across in the commentary of a Jesuit priest, a man called Father Monserrate, who said, only when Gulbadan Begum gave Butzaris were the ladies able to board the ship and depart. And I thought to myself, what the hell is Butzaris? Where is Butzaris? Turned out, Butzaris is Bulsar. It is 60 miles south of Surat, very famous for Alfonso mangoes, for chiku. It's a very rich area, and had been recently allocated as the Jagir, or the land of Gulbadan. And Gulbadan gets into direct negotiations with Portuguese, gives them this land, and then it's a whole fantastic diplomatic negotiation. They leave. At this time, I'm doing 2 things. One is, it's 2020. I've not written the Butzaris chapter. I've written just before that, the permission seeking. It's 2020 August, and I get a fellowship at the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Studies, and I go. And the world has locked down. And I am amidst the most itinerant figure. And she is, following in the track of the most itinerant figures in Western Arabia. And I cannot move. International borders are shut. My father dies in India. I cannot get to mourn with my mother. And I'm frozen. And then one morning, a week after my father dies, I'm in Sweden, fantastic ships. I begin to look at images of ships, and something begins to happen, something begins to thaw. And I knew that I had left Mughal India behind, and I was on to new territories. And we knew nothing about Gulbadan. So I began to look into the Ottoman archives, into the Western Arabian archives. So why Ottomans of Turkey? Because Ottomans of Turkey, especially a man named Murad III, he was the sovereign leader of Western Arabia, including Egypt. Not only him, since 1517, they had they had conquered this land. And one of the important grounds to establish their legitimacy was that the Ottomans had declared themselves as the servitors and the protectors of all who come to the holy cities. So that meant Bedouins, ordinary people, residents, royal authorities. Murad III was in charge. He totally knew that the women of Akbar the Great had landed in his land. The year they land in 1577 was the year of great deprivation in Western Arabia. There had been a famine. They were low on grain. And usually also they relied for grain on Egypt. And within a year of arriving, I found out that in the National Archives in Turkey, in roughly middle of 1578, there was a first eviction order issued by Murad III. And 2 copies of the orders were sent to the Sharif of Mecca and the Sharif of Medina, very important authorities, saying these women of the great, may God bless him, of Akbar the Great, they've been living here as mujawwiran, as have the Indian pilgrims. Please, as soon as you get this order, they need to go. A year later, a second order was issued. They didn't budge. A third order was issued. They didn't budge. 1580, they were still going on. And what were they doing? They were going around dispersing arms, not the formal arms that Akbar had sent, but the women were in front of every possible space, be it the great mosque of Mecca, be it, in their travels. They traveled to all sorts of places, including northern Iraq, and may have gone into the Iranian territories, according to one of the court critics, Badayani. And so literally Gulbadan and the women were walking on the feet of legitimacy of Murad III, and this was not palatable. So then what is a pilgrimage? The image that people had was that, yes, people used to say to me, oh yes, this elderly aunt of, Akbar the Great. And I've heard these elderly aunts and, women behind the thing. And I've always been instinctively in my gut uncomfortable about these very bad descriptions. One thing that really caught my eye, and I think it had to do with the fact that this word was being used in the eviction orders all the time, which is mujawwiran. And I dived deeper and saw that the entire history of the Arabian lands, prophetic lands, land of Abram, land of Muhammad, right, land of seekers, people had spent years and years and years, of course doing the pilgrimage, but also just traveling, right? Looking at Zubaydah, the great Zubaydah that we know of the Abbasids, she had created some of there was 1,000-mile waterworks that she had created, right? Between Mecca and Iraq. Or the Persians that had built cisterns just outside of Jeddah. These are very arid lands. So from the Mughal family themselves, the emperor's mother had gone to Mecca and Medina. And we have absolutely no documentation of what happened to her journey, except that it was an extremely short journey, right? So this whole tradition of mujawwiran began to occupy my mind, because there was no negotiation with Akbar how long they're going to stay. And one of the lines in the official history, which was commissioned after she comes back, called The History of Akbar or Akbarnama, one line in a manuscript form in the British Library says, the women did not want to return, right? That said, those lines, right? I tend to look habitually where people don't look. And I think those lines, that one line of Mansarate, the women did not want to come back home. The void generated by a broken line on folio 83. These were things I was, living with, and I think I've met her anew.
I'd like to welcome you to join this conversation. We'll continue up here, but if anybody has a thought or a question about what we've discussed so far, or you want us to take this conversation to a different place, we're here for you.
Thank you very much for the introductions to Gulbadan. Is she the first victim, or is she the first instigator of the Mughal rule that the female or daughters of the kings are not allowed to marry, so that they don't create a rival to the throne? That's what I read somewhere else, but I would like to hear your opinions on that.
Question.
Sure, Gulbadan was married, and it's very interesting. Her commitment to the project of the empire is so phenomenal that there are only in brief ways that she talks about her husband, and mostly in places where she is telling him which brother he must, of hers, which brother she must align and which he must not align, right? Those sorts of conversations. So this aspect of Mughal women not marrying, this is a very late aspect in the dynasty of the empire. To me, I mean post Shah Jahani. To me, the critical question is really, what does marriage mean? As we've been talking here, I've one way or another I've been hinting at, although I've not directly spoken about this. But I think this big question in English, this big word that we think about a lot, freedom, right? What does freedom mean? How is matrimony tied to freedom? What does childbirth mean in this time? It is not a bourgeois notion of let's have a child together, but child really quite essentially in the project of the empire, because if children didn't last, the empire will not last, right? So I think, to me, the meanings of marriage are really quite extraordinary here, and ones that we'll do well to remember, as in other things. The later Mughal princesses don't marry. I think that there have been suggestions that such and such perfect grooms were not available, and it's been a tradition in this dynasty, right, not always to have royal grooms. There'd been distant marriages with distant cousins. Akbar is known to have married numerous Hindu Rajput women. In fact, Salim, Jahangir future, was the son of Harka, of Amber, a Rajput princess. There were Tibetan princesses in the family. But also, what does Muslim mean at this point? This is also very much tied in my thinking. Again, we have, I think I'm just simply using your lovely question to think all these conceptions, which is, you think Muslim and you think, somebody doing doing the prayers every day and going to Mecca and Medina. I think this is a very modern, stringent sort of way of incarcerating and this kind of obsession with identity. This is who you are, right? Right here, within the Muslim thinking of this world, right? They're playing with, Hinduism. They're playing with Zoroastrianism. They're playing with, Jain thought. They're playing with Advaita, right? Non-dualism. It's quite significant. Multiplicity of languages. So her memoir survives in Persian, but there's a string of Turkish words because that's her birth language. Çağatay Turki, not modern Turkish, right? Which has very little semblance with modern Turkey. Hindavi, which is the amalgam of, it's the in a way the forerunner of Hindi, but it's an amalgam of, Khari, Gwaliari, so many other, languages. So it's that multiplicity, and I think the same to go back to the marriage issue, right? It's much more, complex. Even the choices of not to marry, I think, is a very complex and interesting choice.
Not being allowed.
I don't think so. I don't think so.
While you think about where you want to take the conversation next, that question reminded me of something very interesting, which is, when I think about this book, I wonder, how important is it for a historian like yourself to recover these lost figures, right? These, insofar as they then can become a kind of exemplar or someone who can inspire the current generations, be they women, be they Muslim, be they South Asian, whatever the case may be, who are oftentimes being told a version of history that is very myopic, very, wrong sometimes, right? I mean, the historian has a whole lot of obligations, but in this particular case, reviving this life also provides a kind of inspiration for this generation, doesn't it? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, that is a sole question. That is, I think, what drives everything that I do. And I began by saying that what fascinates me most is the human movement and migration in world history. Now, I am a daughter of migrants. My grandparents on both sides moved from the north of Pakistan into northern India just before, August 1947. And their whole association, their memories, their pleasures, their languages, they were located in Dir and Swat, on the border of northern Afghanistan. Some of the places that the Mughals had earlier traversed. It's the same, sorts of regions. My grandparents were, Hindus, but their languages were Pashto and Urdu. Their friends were, the Muslims that they had left behind. Their love was in the Swat Valley. And then soon, when they came to northern India, they began this amalgamation and love of new rivers. Pashto and Urdu began to be blended with Hindi, more Punjabi, and they started sharing their stories with their granddaughters, such as myself. And so this has obsessed me. Why has this obsessed me? Because I think their life and then this particular historical condition that I have spent my life learning is that it exemplifies that pluralism that we are very proud of in India, right? That many ways of belonging, that many ways of being. And I think that is highly regulated by the modern nation state, right? The charge is that you have to be, you are a good citizen if you speak one language, if you have one religion, this is who you are. And, more than the political aspect of it, in my skin, it doesn't feel right? And so it is not surprising that the, modern nation state, the Hindu right-wing state in India, has eliminated Mughal history from school textbooks and from college curriculum, right? But the Gen Z, going back to the Gen Z you were so beautifully speaking about in your talk, that Gen Z in India and so many other people have created a new social forum, right? They are hungry for these stories because, I think to myself, if we erase these histories, what are we doing? It's a civilizational loss. We are creating, to my mind, as an historian, writing history is a civilizational project, right? And you're producing truncated citizens if you are eliminating histories. So that's really where this comes in.
I think I saw a hand right up in front here. Where should we go next in this conversation?
Hi, Ruby. Fascinating talk. Thank you for that. If you were to divest yourself completely of the constructs of your socio-historical identity, which I think you and I share, you're talking about, your Hindu grandparents like mine owning swaths of land in Pakistan and then, being forced out of Pakistan, into Hindu India, that was created in 47. But if you were to be, now you find yourself located in the United States, my question to you is, when you were reading Gulbadan's memoir / autobiography / I wouldn't know what it is, what was your knee-jerk reaction if you were to completely, bare yourself of the socio-political, historical constructs of your own knowledge, your own, identity, and just read it as an interesting document that you are, what acts of resistance were being kind of, were right there, the subtext, and how did you translate it into, the non-fiction book that you kind of write, and you're so passionately kind of driven by that it took you so much research. Thank you.
That's a lovely question, and it's a question about her form and my form, and about our relationship in some ways, and that relationship is a very long one. What I was struck by as soon as I read it, I was struck by how unique and how exemplary the form was. I've lived with chronicles for a very, very medieval chronicles for a very long time. So let me just give you a few examples. And what I love about her writing, of course, is deeply grounded upon, the kissa form, that is the storytelling form. It's a form. The terms of this form was the terms of my girlhood. I have a fabulous storytelling mother. But the point about storytelling in my home, and I think in the South Asian context, is that what is story? This is something people talk about too easily, or tell stories and write a beautiful book. For me, it's not decided. And here's why. Because I think when my mother used to tell me those stories, I would see a glint in her eye, and depending on the glint in my eye, I think I, and the story was transformed, right? That is what I think I began to see in this unique, and you're absolutely right. It is an unclassifiable genre, right? We can establish how many books she read. She adored her father's memoirs, right? But it is not at all like that. A distinctive quality of her writing is, what I absolutely love, is a stream of consciousness style of writing, which is, which is kind of layers upon layers upon layers, and then you have these idiotic translators saying she doesn't know her dates. It breaks your heart, right? So this is the exquisite character of the writing that you begin to see. And when I was writing this book, one of the things, I met her anew. Of course, I wrote that first, academic monograph. I wrote 2 other books subsequently. And I said to myself, what form do I want to take in this writing? And I wanted my writing to be not in a deliberate sense of the word, because of the lands that she was traversing, right? The rivers, the architecture, the kind of places of piety and beauty. It's so visual. So what historians call context, right? They say context and they mean backdrop. That's not how my writing is structured. And that was a deliberate act, which is that contexts are narrative, right? So when you're describing a river is amidst us. It's a character, right? And Gulbadan's form, in a way, inspires me to do that. That's my relationship with that memoir. I will say, on the first aspect, I think philosophically, it is an impossible proposition to ask me or oneself to take away the... it's a human person, a woman, a man, a girl. We are palimpsestic, right? There are all these layers, the story of my mother, the migration story of my grandparents, the politics of the country, that's kind of breaking our hearts, the way male historians have erased history. This is all very much part of my being, in a way, right? It's an impossible, absolutely philosophically impossible to say that yes, I can remove myself. I think it's something it's something I think about a lot. I mean, I'm not trying to give you an answer, but just to share the impossibility, in a way, of this venture. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, indeed, you do quite the opposite. Far from trying to remove yourself, you really lean in with yourself, and in fact, you're a very serious academic and lauded historian. But this doesn't read like a boring history book. You were talking about how Gulbadan is fundamentally a storyteller, but you yourself also become a kind of storyteller. We can talk a little bit about that style of writing, which I think is becoming more and more key for a lot of historians, particularly those who are writing to a broader audience. But what I'm interested in is why. Yeah. Why is it important as a historian to write like that?
Yeah, great. Again, another soul question. And the thing is that I got very tired. I've just given you one or two little lines about my disenchantment with male historiography. But it's not just male historiography. It is the ossified character of writing, right? It is not engaging. And I have struggled since Empress, right? To, the form, the narration, storytelling that we were talking about, it's far from decided, right? And I think that's where the Gen Z is drawing in. I mean, and that's really where one of the things that kept on coming up, speaking of the form, when I was on the road with Empress, including in this very room, William and I were talking about at this very hour on that book, and two people stood up and said to me, why don't you write that book, Empress for Young Adults? And, I thought, oh God, no, I can't do this. And I calculated 20 times it happened. When it happened on the 20th time, Molly Crabapple, the gorgeous painter, and I had become friends with each other, and we were writing letters to each other while I was in Sweden. She was sending me her art, and I was writing her letters, and I thought divinity had struck. And I said, Molly, can we get on the Zoom? We did. I said, I've been getting this question. She said, I'm on, before I proposed her this thing. And Molly's story is really interesting. She has loved the Persian forms for a long, long time. And she's right now completing all the drawings. But that form itself, right? You've just done this gorgeous, absolutely extraordinary book. While doing that young adult version, I kept thinking to myself, people have all sorts of notions about, and I mean intellectuals have all sorts of notions about young adults. They literally think they're buffoons, they're half adults. They are people in the stage where they are. So how are you going to have that conversation with them? And that is not an easy thing to do. And you were one of my inspirations because you've been for so long talking about the importance of conversation that can rid fear, right? And I think that is what drives me, right? I want to share, I want to talk. And form is another thing. I'm also very driven by, I want to write my next book as a chronicle. That's what I want to do if I can.
And you're probably, I would imagine, sitting there and thinking to yourself, well, that sounds fantastic and that sounds obvious. And of course, that's how you reach a broad audience. But you may not be aware of the fact that within academia, everything that Ruby just said is haram. Everything that she just said is an excuse for the institution to dismiss you as not serious, right? And it's I hear it all the time. I'm sure you hear it all the time. But by definition, if you are focused on speaking to an audience beyond this particular group, then we don't have to take you seriously any longer. And it's an absurd challenge. And so I bring that up just so you understand that as obvious as what Ruby is saying may sound, it is profound heterodoxy is
Yes.
what is actually being said here. Where should we go next? Yes. Anyone? You decide.
I do want to, while we are taking the question, I do want to say that, of course, once you get prizes, your universities love you, right? And the second thing is, whether they like it or not, those very academics that are raising their eyebrows, they all want to write trade books.
True.
And they say,
So true.
well, what does it take? Take away the footnotes.
So true, so true. As Henry Kissinger, I think, famously said, the politics of academia are so cutthroat because the stakes are so low.
Yeah, yeah.
Professor Love, could you talk a little bit about the tools of the trade? As you're navigating through these manuscripts, you have to be facile in Indo-Persian,
Yes.
and I guess Turkish as well, and Arabic. And is that something that is a slog for you? Does computer-assisted translation or AI help?
That's a great question. So I've been trained in Indo-Persian for about 20 years now. So these manuscripts are, very important. There's also an assumption about the world that I study where people think that it's just a textualist world. I was talking about visuality. And it is an absolutely extraordinary, world that's visual. And so for the last 10 years, I've been training myself in, and I mean in serious technical terms, training myself in the artistic traditions, the iconography of this art, because historians tend to make all these absolutely absurd divisions. This is for art history, and this is for history, and this is for politics, right? Poetry, architecture, these are all very distinct languages of statecraft. So this is what I've been developing. Once I crossed the Indian Ocean, up the Red Sea and on to Western Arabia, I have leaned, I've studied very extensively the historiography, which means how the whole field has navigated, the modern history field has navigated the writings and so on. So very much part of those debates. I have learned some Ottoman Turkish, not all, and I have taken a lot of help from my Ottoman Turkish scholars. So the documentation is mainly on that side in Ottoman Turkish, and which is where all these kind of words were coming in. So it's a much bigger field than just a textualist field.
I don't want to ignore this side over here. So is there a mic over here? Yes, how about right next to you?
Hello, I really appreciate this conversation because it's very enlightening as far as growing up in this country. We have a very Eurocentric educational system. It's not really we don't really learn a lot about other regions of the world. And I was hoping you could please elaborate on some things as far as you were talking about. Another thing we don't really learn about the
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. And you know, one of the things, as a professor of South Asian history, I teach at Emory University. One of the things that's disturbed me quite a lot in the conversations, sometimes with my own colleagues, is this kind of rather tired understanding of the past and present, right? Heavy demarcation, but also, or sometimes things like how the past, informs the present. My own position on this is, again, that kind of philosophical position that there is no other way to access past except from the vantage point of where we stand today. There is no other way philosophically, right? And the second is this, somewhat getting away from this urge to establish the truth, right? When my students say, so this is again way more complicated, at least in my thinking, it is not a matter of let me give you many perspectives, right? Then the students will rightly say, so then which perspective do we go by? And this is where, whether you teach about South Asia, or you teach about America, or you teach about Europe, right? One significant principle for me is that when you read a history book, how do you in your gut feel about that history book? Do you think something is being eliminated, right? But most importantly, is this book eliminating, right, women, migrants, powerless people as we call it? And I don't mean powerless, they are not powerless. They have been made invisible, powerless, disenfranchised in the very act of writing history. I think the moment you make that point to your students, they are on board with you. It just does not matter what materials you are talking about. And totally then the connections begin to take place, right? They're constantly, I mean, I've always encouraged, because I'm talking about this very presentist way of thinking about the past, then how can we be sitting in American classrooms, right, and not be thinking about America as we are delving into South Asian history, right? That's. I don't know if this helps, but these are, I mean, as you might sense, I'm very opposed to any heavy form of categorization or incarceration. I think our students are with us in this, luckily, right? Or at least many students are with us.
Question from a lady. I think we've heard from enough men. You decide.
Thank you. I mean, you're speaking on so many different levels. It's really wonderful. I appreciate. I read a book called Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World by Weatherford. And he says, I have actually two questions. He says that Mughal is a bastardization of Mongol. Is that true?
Is that the only question?
Well, the other question is just writing the suppression of women because of patriarchy through so many historical traditions. How do you overcome that?
Okay.
Also.
Yes. So the Mughals were the descendants of Genghis Khan and Timur, right? Maternal and paternal lines, 5 generations down. That was definitely part of the inheritance. But by the time Babur is in India, he has encountered not only the Uzbeki culture, not only the, to be literate in those worlds. And by literate, I don't mean educated. I mean literate in the senses, cultivated man of adab, or a woman of adab. You had to know Persian, right? So there were all these languages that were intermingling. And I won't say that it's a bastardized version. That's how it came to be in the writing, right? Mongol, Mughal, Mughal, all sorts of versions begin to take place. Your second question is a very powerful question. And, the short answer, and I'm going to try and unpack that. the way in which I've answered this question to myself. Okay, let me backtrack. Each book that I've written, this is my 4th book. Each book, it lessened by the time I was doing more public history books, but let's say the first 2 books. I was constantly asked the question, because I was not writing on traditional male projects. I was asked the question, how are you going to do this? There are no sources for it. It's a classic. This is when people had known Gulbadan's phenomenal text that we've been talking about. Jahan, Empress, the astonishing reign of Jahan, richly documented. From her time, non-stop, textual, visual, architectural. One scholar said to me, with a little more nuance, doesn't she appear in representation? So I turned around and I asked him, what does not? Right? I mean, is the Akbarnama not representation? Is a picture not representation? And with these questions, I have thought to myself, in the end, and this is a very present resonance we are going to feel here, right? When it comes to a feminine experience, or when it comes to a woman figure, there is always a knee-jerk reaction. It is male disbelief. That's what I've come to call. And I don't mean men's disbelief. I'm using the word male because of certain kinds of historical and intellectual inheritances that led particular male scholars to firm up and ossify our history as it is, right? And I'm done with it, right? I think I have wonderful interlocutors. I think there are too many important questions to write. I think, at the cost of sounding really immodest, I think my intervention with the archives philosophically is now taken more seriously than any of those writings. So I think that question is settled. But it is a really important question. That again, I discuss how do we think about evidence is a question I ask my students. Just because something is sitting in the British Library doesn't mean it holds the truth, right?
I can't help myself. We're out of time, unfortunately, but I can't help myself. I just want to get you in a little bit of trouble. And you can pass if you want to, but let's pretend Gulbadan Begum showed up today, right now, in India. What would she think of this government and this society? What would be her judgment?
I think she would say, my God, this is way more extreme than what my nephew was doing.